Okay, now that we have our routers, we need some computers on this guy. So I'm just going to add one computer to this, and we will see how a packet goes from router C onto the main network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a client 1 computer, and it's going to be a Linux computer, 64-bit. That's fine. Just keep this going. And again, we just make a base machine. Now this guy, what I'm going to do before we turn it on is I'm going to change its network, and this network adapter 1, we just want to say internal network 3. So again, if you look at our network diagram, this defines where it's connected. So then we hit start, and it's going to do the same thing. It's going to say, hey, there's no drive. What do you want? We don't want to install Pfsense though. We're going to install Ubuntu and hit start here. So then we're going to do a different install. So again, same deal. We're just going to pass through. So by default, it's going to boot up in a try Ubuntu with it out installing. I mean, that could be fine, but we want to actually do the install. So let's hit install Ubuntu. And this will copy it to the disk. So you'll have to make sure you select that option quickly before it sort of just boots into the try mode. And again, the installer, just use all defaults here. It's nothing too fancy is needed. So you're basically just going to have to go through, continue. Don't download anything while we're installing. Erase disk, that's fine. This is just the virtual disk it's installing. Again, we're not touching the real hard drive. Use all defaults. And eventually, you'll notice it's off screen here. I can't see the button. So if we just hit the enter button, it'll continue on. So that's fine. And I'm going to use the name student. You can change this if you want, of course, it's up to you, as well as the password student. And again, just hit enter here because I can't see. If you make the screen a bit bigger from the start, you might have had better luck, but I left it as a default. Once it finishes installing, it's going to reboot. And again, we'll have to do the same thing. Before it reboots, we got to eject that drive so that we don't boot back into the live CD. And you'll see it if it boots into the live CD. It'll be kind of obvious when that's happened. But this will give us a Linux client that we can now sort of play with and attach anywhere in the network. So that's one of the ideas, is we could attach this at a few spots. So we can do a clone in a similar way. And see what's happening with the device. So let's just wait for this. And if it's sort of, actually what's happened here is it's trying to connect through the network and we haven't configured stuff yet. It should be able to work without any network connectivity. But what we can do to speed it up is we can actually disconnect the network to force it. To avoid doing that, so all I've done is I've expanded this. And this will force it to just not try to download anything. So what you'll notice is that because some of this stuff, the network isn't working, we can do stuff too, of course. So the nice thing about this is we can decide where to connect this guy. So we can say, connect directly to the host network, connect to any of those 3 internal networks. So we can sort of, virtually plug in and unplug our network cable, let's call it. So eventually we got to here. It's asking to restart. So again, we'll eject this. It's not this now, so we'll restart it. And we'll just eject it when we can. Okay, and there it's ejected, and reboot. Just confirm there's no check mark there. So now it should actually boot the Ubuntu. So this will be our Linux host that has web browser and stuff like that. So we'll just let that boot, log in, and we can see how our network configuration is working. So for Ubuntu, for reference, we don't need this. One of the things you might need is a console. So you can get a console under System Tools LX Terminal here. So this is our console. So you can see something's gone on with our networking, and that's because we don't have a connected adapter right now. So we're going to connect the cable. And we can see we weren't connected yet. There we go. So we're in the 4 range. So where's our network routing? So you can see if I try pinging, it might not work right away. One of the things we should look at now is, well, if I ping an IP address, so 8.8.8.8 is Google's DNS, it's working, but if I just ping dal.ca, it's not working. So we never actually configured any of those routers that I installed. So there's different ways of doing this. What we're looking at quickly is actually the kind of the Pfsense API. So if we go to 192.168.4.1, we're going to log in with admin and the password of Pfsense, and it's going to do this initial setup wizard. So that's great. And you can basically, most of this is fine as default. So one of the things here is we actually don't have a DNS server. So Pfsense lets us configure this. So I'm going to point it to Google's DNS server, so that hopefully we're actually able to resolve stuff. The rest of this I think is all fine. We don't need any of this configuration. So we already did some of this stuff before. We're not going to set a password. Again, it's going to warn you about this because that's very bad. All right. So we now have a basic router setup on this computer. So I didn't do any of the other router configurations. They're just using straight defaults. So you can plug the computer in. So now you'll notice this dal.ca ping worked because we did the DNS configuration correctly. So now that we have a working computer here, we would actually like to confirm that we're seeing the connection. So we're going to install something called traceroute. Is go sudo apt update. So we have to do this first before anything will work. It'll try to do it during the installation, but if we didn't have a working network, as I didn't at that point because the router wasn't configured yet, then it will not work. So we run it afterwards, and we kind of wait for this thing to finish. Once it finishes, I can run my apt install, sudo apt install traceroute. So it's sort of a 2-step process here to get traceroute installed. So you can just wait for this guy to finish running. Okay. Okay, there we go. So now if we go sudo apt install traceroute, hopefully this works. Perfect. So if I go traceroute, we can traceroute now, for example, to dal.ca. And what's the important thing to us? What I want you to see is that the first few here are actually within your network. So we're at the 4.1, this is us. 3.1, 1.1, and then this 10.0.2.2. So you can see there's a few steps between this computer and dal.ca. So that's kind of the objective of it, is to print this to show you that you're routing between these 3 computers. So this is all static route, of course, at this point. We're not doing anything too interesting on them, but it demonstrates how you're able to configure these devices. The final thing that's kind of interest is, so through Pfsense, you can see quite a bit of tools you have access to. So if we go to Pfsense, let's log back into this guy here. That's not going to resize on me. We can do some other interesting stuff. So you can play around with firewall rules. We can play around with various system configurations, even stuff like DNS. So as an example, you should do some DNS changes. So I'm going to do a host override, for example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to override smu.ca, and I'm going to get the IP address of dal.ca, and we're just going to put that in. So you can actually see how the domain name service, which we want host, I want smu.ca is the domain. It's going to resolve smu.ca to this IP address. And I'm going to call it dal override and save that and apply changes. So now if you try to go to smu.ca once this reboots, what's going to happen is my local router attached to this computer is going to resolve that to the Dalhousie website. So you can see how having control over the DNS lets you do a lot of tricky business. If we change this, so if you remember, I have the ability to switch where this is connected. So I could connect this back to my initial router, and let's do the same thing. I'm still reconnecting. And now it's going to the right spot because I no longer have my sneaky DNS redirect happening. That DNS redirect was only happening on one of the routers. So on real networks, it shows you some of the issues around, if someone has control over this router. Then again, we can wait for it to reconnect. If someone's trying to go to SMU, then I have someone redirecting it via DNS. So that's the basic setup. Oops, I think it was already starting. The basic setup for a network that we are using in this lab.